In Star Trek, there is a race whose impulses are so destructive and dangerous that they saw no other option than to take the extreme measure of suppressing all emotion lest they cave to their primal nature of paranoia and aggression. This species are the Vulcans, the first extraterrestrial race encountered by mankind on the 5th of April 2063. Hi, Rick here, and today we're indexing a species for the second time, as the original Vulcan video was only about 7 minutes long, and I think I can do better. So, here is the Vulcan index reforged. Get it? Forged because of Vulcan? Never mind. Originating from the planet Vulcan, known as Minshara or T-Valkain in some dialects, the Vulcan physiology is rather robust when compared to humans. They have a variety of skin tones ranging from dark browns to pale with a faint greenish hue. This green tint is the result of their copper-based blood. As their planet has an arid climate, they're better at processing dry air, and they can survive on little water, starvation, and can go over a week without sleep. They also had an inner eyelid to protect against the Vulcan sun's harsh rays. A healthy Vulcan could typically live for well over 200 years. Internally, they were very different than humans, having their heart where a human's liver would be, and their muscle density was higher than a human's, giving them about 3 times the physical strength. They also possessed a unique bioelectrical chemistry, which manifested itself in a number of telepathic abilities. Vulcans could use these powers to focus their minds, connect their consciousness with others through a mind meld, and most fascinatingly, transfer a katra into another vessel or person's psyche. This katra is still somewhat of a mystery, being akin to a soul, but for a deeply scientific people such a concept is rather strange. Yet a katra does indeed seem to be the entire essence of a Vulcan, from their memories to the way they think. Such telepathic connections, once established, could echo for a long time and over light years, and strong events could be detected by Vulcans in other locations, such as the destruction of the USS Intrepid. This bioelectric chemistry could also be used to employ a nerve pinch, which could shock most central nervous systems, causing the receiver to pass out. This technique could be employed by non-Vulcans with varying degrees of success, most often with no result, however. The Vulcan martial art of Susmana, as well as numerous grapples, featured multiple nerve-attacking techniques. On the opposite side of the spectrum, neuropressure massage was a therapy to manipulate these same nodes for relaxation. One strange facet of Vulcan physiology, however, is the pon farr. A very private affair for a Vulcan, naturally, but every 7 years an adult Vulcan experiences their fertility cycle, which drives them to seek out a mate within 8 days. The hormonal and neurochemical imbalances caused by this drive can be so severe that it leads to death. One thing to note, however, is that Vulcans could reproduce outside of this cycle, and intensive meditation, or bloody combat, could also end the pon farr. The planet Vulcan itself, despite being quite harsh, does have a varied climate, including rainy seasons and oceans, but it's mostly known for its sandy and rocky plains. One of the most unforgiving environments on Vulcan is the Forge, a desert where electrical sandstorms are common, or the Fire Plains, the most famous geologically active site on the planet. The flora and fauna of Vulcan is also rather varied, including the Salat, a sort of saber-toothed bear, which had wild and domesticated varieties. There were also sandworms and the Chikaria, both of which were burrowing creatures to avoid the harsh sunlight. Technically, Vulcan had no moons, however it shared a close orbit with a sister planet that did, called Takut, that was often visible from Vulcan's surface at varying stages of orbit. The capital city was Shakar, which housed the Vulcan Science Academy among other institutions. Young Vulcan children are educated in very trying learning centres that require great focus and mental discipline. Graduating from the Vulcan Science Academy was an impressive achievement, and Starfleet considered it of equal merit to Starfleet Academy. Starfleet operated in cohort with the Vulcan High Command and Science Academy, granting them entire ships to be on extended service to the Vulcan people, such as the aforementioned USS Intrepid of 2268. The central government of Vulcan is the High Command, which manages various divisions such as the Science Council, the Science Directorate, the Ministry of Information, Ministry of Security, as well as a diplomatic corps. As part of the United Federation of Planets, the High Command adheres and helps to set Federation policy, and much of Vulcan's own military power is tied in with Starfleet. As noted, it retains its own security divisions for planetary protection, as most member worlds do. The High Command consists of the heads of these divisions, overseen by an administrator. This race has had a long history, and is one of the most fleshed out in the Trek universe, with ancient Vulcans following religions of war and death. Homicidal urges were commonplace, but nonetheless they evolved as a culture, eventually learning to create interstellar travel around the 9th century BC. Some Vulcans from around this era had begun to practice meditation and suppress their emotions in order to live healthier lives, and had established monasteries on nearby planets such as Pagem. The species as we know them originated truly around 300 AD. While humanity was mucking around in Byzantium, the Vulcans were engaged in nuclear civil war. It was during this time where factions between nations formed, including Surak's followers and those who marched beneath the Raptor's wings. Surak had established a way of living that followed the pursuit of enlightenment through logic that was fast spreading among the Vulcan populace. However, those who opposed the teachings left in exile. Surak's teachings were preserved in the Kirshara, and the Mans Katra was also preserved as he died on Mount Seleia. His teachings and way of life became the bedrock for Vulcan society, and he is seen in many ways as the saviour of their civilization from themselves. The very emblem for Vulcan became the mountain of Seleia, a triangle of logic, the most sturdy, simple mathematical shape, and the sphere of Vulcan representing the people. At the point where these two touch, there is enlightenment, infinite diversity in infinite combinations. The pursuit of this is known as the Kolinar. Emerging from their strife, they began their new philosophy as explorers, seeking to understand the universe around them, and instituted a number of philosophies that would go on to be adopted by the Federation of Planets, of which they became a founding member in 2161, alongside Andoria, Earth and Tellar, in opposition to the rise of the Romulan Star Empire. These included relatively minor things, such as their planetary classification index, to guiding principles such as the non-interference directives. Despite this unifying view, however, the Vulcan people have often been divided with how exactly to approach exploration. In the early 2150s, the Sirianites were a faction who held true to the original teachings of Surak, while the rest of the populace developed a stigma around the more telepathic disciplines. This rift was caused by unknown Romulan manipulation within the Vulcan society. And there were even the Vatosh Katur, the Vulcans who strived to find a balance between emotions and logic. There was even a dark period where a series of attacks were undertaken by logic extremists, who deemed Vulcans superior to the Federation and wished for secession. They had always been an innovative and experimental species, but constant warfare in their pre-Surak times led to frequent loss of progress. For example, they've been capable of interstellar travel for many millennia, with the species developing the rather unique ship design, requiring a ring nacelle rather than the more common twin design. Ships like the Dakir are a good example of this warp drive technology from early periods in their history, with the Apollo and Solkar personal cruiser types continuing variations in this design. For such a scientific-minded people, the Vulcans do have lots of rituals and traditions in their culture. Much of this is tied strongly to their mental abilities, as part of Surak's original teachings and the suppression of emotion. Daily meditations help to maintain emotional control, and there are numerous techniques to be practiced solo or with others to contemplate and calm the mind. Such meditation sessions were to be completed without interruption, and a Vulcan who has neglected to meditate would experience far more vivid dreams as they first sign of emotions resurfacing. If more time persists without meditation, they may find themselves accidentally expressing emotion, a state most find very distracting and even slightly disturbing, often leading to irritability. It is considered bad form to allow emotions to surface among fellow Vulcans, however, as they are meant to make decisions based solely on logic. The Vulcan people observed arranged marriages and more ancient ceremonies such as the kal-if-fee, a passion fight, which was occasionally observed during Pon farr during complicated circumstances, but the act of life or death combat also served to break the blood fever of Pon farr. But alongside these practical applications for ritualistic behaviour, Vulcans do maintain some level of spirituality, with many seeing the katra as evidence of a soul of sorts. Ancient Vulcans believed in shakari, analogous to heaven, and even in the late 24th century there were orders of monks that offered prayers to those who sought counsel, such as the Temple of Amanak. There were also high priestesses who oversaw the health of the katra in a similar way to other organised religions from numerous cultures. Many locations and temples are dedicated to the pursuit of self-improvement through logic or the kolinar, and such areas can date back millennia. The Vulcan language was flowing and written vertically, resembling musical notes, while Vulcan names often included a harsh K sound in males and softer vowel sounds in females. Female Vulcan names traditionally included the prefix of a T, then apostrophe. Not all names fell into these rules, however. Traditional Vulcan clothing was often robes, as is seen in frequent use for official functions and ceremonies. Decoration often adorned these, but rarely for aesthetics' sake. Each ornamentation served to denote some status or service. Such clothing was likely in answer to the climate, but many Vulcans often wore more practical, form-fitting attire beneath, such as those in military service or as an alternative to work in. Some wore long coats or shawls that served as in-betweens of sorts of practicality while still being robe-like in appearance. Vulcan too had a long history of arts, with music being a key focus of many a Vulcan at some point in their lives, such as the Ka'athira lute, and their architecture following similar structural cues. The triangle and arch were common parts of buildings, and a recurring motif in Vulcan design alongside the use of dark reds, browns and oranges that resembled the planet's natural materials. Vulcans often appear dogmatic and rigid to outsiders, but this is not always so. Underneath their tranquil surface, royal currents of emotion that they have had little experience with, and that, when revealed, are often passionate or even destructive. These emotions do creep into their works, especially the arts, and guide their actions subtly as any species, but they seek to mitigate that. Sarek married a human woman not because he was the ambassador to Earth and it made sense, but because he loved her. There is a reason for their intense adherence to the teachings of Surak though. Without it, there'd still be a tribalistic and conflicting culture struggling to get off-world amid repeated wars. Many Vulcans have learned over generations of exposure to other species, such as humanity, to soften their harsh persona somewhat, and faint emotional expression can almost be read. It can be tempting for the unfamiliar to attempt to get a rise out of a Vulcan or to get them to exhibit some emotional expression, but this is generally a bad idea. You really don't want a Vulcan to snap. If a Vulcan is comfortable enough to show you any hint of emotion, they'll do it on their own terms. They generally understand feelings and tolerate such displays from others, but seldom are able to allow themselves to participate or reciprocate in them. As mentioned, they have little experience with their own emotions, suppressing them entirely, so when a Vulcan allows their depths to flow, they are often overwhelmed by them. Not always violently, and I'd argue that in some part their fear of their primal nature is responsible for exacerbating it. It's kind of sad, really. In a galaxy surrounded by cultures revelling in emotional fulfillment, they cannot truly partake. As is always said, Vulcans do have emotion, They're just better at hiding them, and for their own safety, they have to be. Thank you for listening to this index. Even this video is only some basics on the species. Their expansive history, mythology and interactions with other Trek races goes on and on in books and shows, and there's always more to be unearthed. As for the next video, well, let's look at maybe the Breen, which will contain a lot of apocryphal content by necessity, as we don't even canonically know what they look like. Or perhaps the Silence from Doctor Who, the organisation as a whole, that is. Strange, I think I put down a second option, but oh yeah, the Silence from Doctor Who, I've said that. What was I saying? Anyway, thanks for watching this episode of The Index. I've been Rick, and I'll see you next time. Thanks again, and live long and prosper.